And for those of you that might have seen on the agenda, I am not Anthony Walker. I am Sue Daly, Associate Director for Technology and Innovation at Tech UK. And unfortunately, Anthony couldn't join us today. So I am really, really thrilled to be chairing. Don't tell him, but I wanted to do this anyway. Chair this session, focusing on COVID economic recovery and how we achieve inclusive and perhaps also ethical growth. As we know, as we're looking into 2021, we're looking into the future and looking into how we support the recovery of our economy and the role digital transformation and technologies have a role, the role that they can play in our economic growth. But we need to make sure, of course, that that economic growth in a post-COVID recovery is distributed across all parts of society and regions of the UK. So how do we do this? How do we move forward in recovery, rebuilding, reinvention, perhaps traditional industries and sectors? But how do we ensure this next wave of economic growth is driven in an ethical, responsible, inclusive way? And a theme that keeps coming up is how do we bring everybody on this journey with us? How do we make sure we realize the impact on people's lives in and out of work, I would say? And how do we make sure we don't leave anyone behind? So we have a fascinating panel really to get into the devil of some of this detail. And this is an issue actually that we've not really talked about in any great detail. I think we've touched on it before in digital ethics summits, but we haven't really got into this in depth. Really, really thrilled to have such a great panel for you to hear from today on these issues. And what I'm going to do is just very briefly ask them to introduce themselves, and then I have a kickoff question for them all, and then we'll get into a bit of the discussion. So first of all, perhaps we just find out who everybody is, and then we can go forward. So Christina, could you just introduce yourself to everybody and let everybody know where you're from? Oh, and you're on mute, Christina. There you go.
Okay, because it says I'm on mute on my computer. Anyway, hi everybody, Christina Kolchoff here. I'm dialing in from Switzerland. I have been a trade unionist for many, many years and now run my own little shop called the Why Not Lab, where I focus very much on the co-governance of algorithmic systems at work, data governance, and of course, the wider topic of the future of work. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, Christina, it's lovely to have you. Jonathan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Dowden. I'm a product manager at Sage. We create and look after small businesses through our accounting software products. And my sort of key area of interest is micro businesses and self-employed, which again, like all businesses, and particularly small businesses, is a very challenging time.
Absolutely, and it's great to be able to explore that in more detail, Jonathan. Great to have you with us. Priya, great to have.
Thank you so much, Sue. Lovely to be here, and good morning, everybody. So my name is Priya Gujar. I work predominantly with startups and scale-ups in UK and global tech, with a number of hats, including as a venture partner at a VC fund called Merian Ventures that invests in female-led deep technology. I'm also on the board, the Council of Innovate UK, and on the board of the Digital Catapult, and advise a number of startups. So lovely to be here.
Oh, great to have you here. And Hitan.
Hi, I'm Shah. I'm Chief Executive at the British Academy, which is the National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm chair of the Friends Provident Foundation, which is a grant-making body looking at how we can create a fairer economy. And I'm also vice chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is looking at how we do AI and data for public good.
So I hope you all agree with me. It's an esteemed and amazing panel to have with us today. And oh, Hitan, you've come back. That's good. So let's kick off with a bit of an opening question before we get into some of the devil of the detail. I'm interested in people's views on what are the challenges we may need to face in order to achieve inclusive, and it'd be great to know what you think inclusive economic growth means, but inclusive economic growth in the wake of COVID. Obviously, COVID hasn't gone, it will still be with us next year, but as we look to, a vaccine and perhaps, sunrise on the horizon, and looking at how we rebuild and recover the economy, what are the issues that we may need to face to get this right? Hitan, perhaps let's start with you, if we may.
Thanks, Sue. I think one of the challenges is, in a sense, who has this conversation. So those of us who are privileged enough to be able to spend the day working by tuning into a virtual conference are a very privileged set of people. So there is a question of, who is it that is at the table to have a conversation about what an inclusive economy is? It's really easy for us to forget, both how well off we are relative to other people, the fact that people, I think 2/3 of Europe were not able to work from home during the pandemic. So, our experiences are of a particular set, and we have to try and step out of those. But sort of looking beyond that in terms of substance, there's just a whole host of challenges, and I'll just touch on. I'll give you a kind of quick roller coaster tour. There's kind of what's the future of our high streets as the retail kind of industry collapses, and there's a real opportunity there. What are the public finances going to look like given the kind of big hit and the sort of debt that we've taken on? Poverty and destitution. Poverty was already kind of 14 million before COVID started, and destitution we saw yesterday from the Joseph Rantry Foundation is at 1 million and we're likely to rise to 2 million during the sort of pandemic. There's the question of the care economy. So we count paid labor, but actually, what is all of the unpaid labor for caring? And we've seen the importance of care as we've sort of started working from home, and actually the two things sort of cross over with one another. Social infrastructure. So, I think we're coming to realize that those bits of the community where there is high social capital also really helps with economic growth and inclusivity. But how is that kind of across the country? Productivity. The UK has got a real long-hanging productivity problem, 0.3% productivity growth over the last 10 years, year on year, whereas before that it was 2% a year. So how do we grow that? And then finally, environmental issues as well. So thinking about future generations, not just our current generations. And then finally, just to say there is an opportunity, which is moments of rupture mean that people don't have to go back to business as usual. So I think that's the opportunity.
Thanks, Hitan. Really great to-do list in yourself in terms of issues that we really need to think about. Priya, perhaps I could come to you as well. What do you see as what would be on your list or your challenges? And I suppose also, why do you think this matters so much that we get this right?
So for me, COVID has just shone a very stark spotlight on a lot of disparities that were there already in the UK and globally. There is a very long list, and I'm not sure even between all of us on the panel we'll get through it. But for me, the disparities that I'm particularly focused on are things like gender disparities, are things like regional disparities, are things like social inclusion, or in this case, social exclusion. And also, what's really rightly come to the fore this year, which is the challenge of minority representation in all of the different spheres in which we live and work. Now, for me, I think the COVID pandemic has both exacerbated a number of these pre-existing challenges, but also shone a spotlight on them. And I think this is where, piggyback on what Hitan said, we actually have a huge opportunity as society to take this as a realization that we cannot continue with the status quo. The reason why, to answer your second question, Sue, is because actually we are essentially shooting ourselves in the foot if we're not allowing everyone to participate in our economic future. We've seen this with the studies, for example, around the successful nature of businesses who have high representation of from a gender prism, or high representation from a minority ethnic prism that McKinsey have rightly brought to the fore this year. What this means is that as a society, if we continue to exclude people, the whole society loses out. And that's the dynamic that I think we really need to take on board. And if we take it on board, and if we allow the correct participation from all aspects of our society in our economic future, we can change the dial for everybody. And that for me is very simple. but hard to reach prize that we need to be focused on now.
Yeah, I suppose, and then I imagine, Priya, we will get into this of kind of, okay, but then how? How do we do this? But Christina, I saw you nodding away. Is that what you think is really key here in terms of achieving inclusive economic growth in the wake of COVID, or are there other challenges that you see from your perspective that we also need to be thinking about?
I mean, I just want to say I want to piggyback on both of you, Priya and Hitan, for what you've said. Amazing and very important points of views. Unfortunately, if I can be a little bit stark, yes, we have the opportunity now to rethink everything. But we also know that institutions are very sluggy and people are quite lazy. And if we do not deliberately demand change, it's not going to happen. And we have to do that together and enforce. So in addition to the things that you were saying, I think, one of the prime issues we're going to have to talk about again is taxation. How are we going to fund the welfare state or the state? How can we make sure that education, and upskilling, for example, is inclusive for all workers and also those outside of work right now? But, at the moment, many analyses show that workers who work for large companies have far more access to re and upskilling than workers in small and medium-sized companies. And of course, now we have a rising number of workers on precarious contracts. We can't expect an Uber driver to take 2 weeks out of earning any income to go on a course. So here we have to say, how do we talk about redistribution and taxation again in this spirit of rebuilding the economy, and I think also addressing the productivity problem, right? And then secondly, we need a new social contract. We have seen many workers in the UK especially who have fallen outside of any program of recovery or help during the COVID crisis. And this is artists, it's film people, it's actors, it's gig workers. So how can we say work is work, no matter how it's conducted and under which contractual forms? All workers in all forms of work should have the same social and fundamental rights, and that is also rights to social benefits. So, of course, that those two aspects are very important. I think my third point is, we need to talk again. We need to break down these very antagonistic relations between management and labor and say, with the digital technologies where literally any future is possible, how do we together, and here, Priya, I really agree in what you were saying as well, how do we together bring the voices to the table and discuss how we should govern these technologies, flush out bias and discriminations to ensure that we actually adhere to the principles of inclusivity and diversity. And my last point in all of this will be that we also, really have to understand that technological solutionism isn't going to be the answer. It will be very easy to fall back on, oh, we just need to automate and we need to make things more productive and more efficient, and AI is great for that. And people almost fall prey to technology holding the answer. And that would be a very dangerous route to go down, because technology without governance, without new institutions, is dangerous.
Thank you, Christina. A lot to unpack there, but absolutely fascinating. Jonathan, before we perhaps unpack some of these issues, be interested in your views from what you've heard. Does this chime with you? Are these the challenges we may need to face and think about, or are there others, particularly as given your work at Sage and given your work looking at SMEs and micro businesses? What's key to getting this right for them as well? What do they need?
So I think my fellow panelists have covered a really comprehensive list there, and I think all of those points are relevant and apply to kind of SMEs and micro businesses. I think there's two really key points here, and it's the same, micro business and an individual. It's the ability for them to participate in this changing, evolving economy. And I think when we consider that perhaps over half of micro businesses at the moment are not, well, our small businesses are not making any money. And many of them already, about 61% that we found, are realizing that they're not investing in the tech, they're not able to invest at the level that they believe they need to be able to, help and assist their post-COVID recovery. That's why it's not just about that investment in technology, but it's also, as Christina talked about, the skills and upskilling. So it's all very well, we can have great technological advances, but if that technology cannot be used by those who are at the risk of being left behind, then as I think Priya mentioned before, these divisions that have always been there and COVID has shone a light on are going to get bigger, and that is going to create a real serious problem. And I also agree with Christina, and also a great article she wrote on the future of unsustainable work, that technology isn't the solution in its own right. It must be much wider than that, because the kind of future that we could be looking at, if technology without governance is able to run away, is really could be quite dark. However, we have to be positive. This situation does create a huge opportunity, and the fact that we're having these discussions and shining lights in these areas has to be a good thing. But it is a collective endeavor, and we have to talk, and we have to bring everyone along with everyone.
No, fascinating. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm sure we'll get into that more detail, but I thank you all. I think it's really highlighted some of the issues and highlighted some of the challenges if we don't get this right, what this could look like if we don't get this right. And it is an opportunity, but then following on from what Priya was talking about, okay, well then how do we do this, and what do we need to do this in a inclusive, ethical, responsible, sustainable way for everybody, right? So some of the choices that we make now could really have a positive impact on inclusive growth across the UK. So I suppose the point being, what are the choices? What do we need to make? What do we need to therefore do, and how do we move forward? And I'm wondering, Hitan, if I can come to you in terms of the kind of, we talked about opportunities, but also, I think Christina, you talked about opportunities, but also the need to demand change. And there's a bit of a push-pull factors currently existing here about how do we get this right. I'm wondering from your perspective of, do we have the mechanisms? Do you think we have the tools? Do you think we have what we need to think about what the right choices are? How do we get this right? Particularly in terms of that kind of push-pull factor. Do you think we have what we need, or is there something missing? Perhaps before we get on to what should we do we have what we need to even decide or even come to an agreement as to what needs to be done?
So I think it's a great question, and in a way, is the economy is a wicked problem, so it's hard to characterize even what the problem is, let alone what a solution would look like. So, and I think in a sense what all of us have been talking about is we need an economy that works for everybody. So the first stage is to actually have everybody round the table in some way to be able to contribute to that conversation of what that would look like. And let me just take high streets as a kind of example of this, as a sort of little microcosm. What we've had over the last 20 years is sort of Clonestown Britain. Everywhere looks the same around the country. That's now imploding. There is a moment for change where we could redesign city centres, but who will make those decisions? Will it be a kind of laissez-faire thing where landlords will just try and extract as much rent as they can? They don't really care who goes in. Or will we think about who is using this? What do women want from city centres, and how should they be designed? Because their voices are rarely heard in these conversations. Should local government be buying up units and then giving them over to community businesses? So you create some kind of mixed economy in the centre. I mean, these are the sorts of ways in which I think at a kind of microcosm, you could change the way the economy looks. And there are examples, for example, in Preston or Wrexham, there's some quite interesting things going on at quite a micro level. So what are the lessons that we can learn and build up from there? At the same time, I think there's a really big issue, which is the economy is kind of happens at a very macro level. It's quite hard to get our hands around, and the power we have is limited, which is why Christina is right that unless we collectively demand change, it is a sort of political issue. You'll just get more of the same.
Absolutely, yeah, I'm well aware that this is a big macro problem, and trying to fix it in an hour just to manage expectations. I don't think we're going to do that. But
Sue, can I add something into what Hitan was saying there?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think for me, the one big missing piece is data, particularly in relation to data on the impact of government policies on underrepresented groups. So I've been working on this with a fantastic team within Innovate UK, part of UKRI, because one of the things that was quite striking to all of us there was that when we were intervening to give support to businesses, when you were doing that 5 years ago, the impact or tracking of where that money goes wasn't linked to gender, wasn't linked to minority representation, etc. And so now, in the work that Innovate's doing, we're now mainstreaming across all of the different activities to make sure we're tracking where the money is going, to whom, and making interventions that can then change the dynamic of where money is going to. And I think there's a really, really important point missing here, because that is not happening across every single government intervention. And I say government as a national level, but this equally applies to local interventions at community level. We need to know where taxpayers' money is going and understand the problems that is creating, because in the same way that I believe sometimes funding is reinforcing the status quo because that data is not being tracked, to turn to your point about where opportunities lie, I do believe there's an opportunity for actually government money to be used to nudge in the direction of change to support underrepresented groups and start getting that more equitable conversation that Hitan's talking about.
Fascinating, Priya. Thank you for jumping in. Christina, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, no, I think excellent points, and I think there's something that combines the two comments before. So cities data is very much around the huge problem right now that a lot of government public services are dependent on private sector tools to get data, or they're doing it through public procurement or outsourcing, which is actually, if you look at it, the capacity within the public services to build their own data interpretations, the visualizations, is declining. So you're having an increasing private sector dependency, but also a very unilateral way of looking at the world. So how are we understanding the data, or what are we even looking at? And I think that speaks very much to Priya's point here, is what are we looking at in terms of the demands to the variables, but also then how do we transform that into policy? And I think in relation to the cities and how can we bring multiple voices, and cities is just now a geographical space. This could be a rural community, it could be anything. Will demand that we have joint access and control over the data that's produced, so that we can interpret it together. That we have all these fancy AI principles now, and one of them is a principle of fairness, but then we have to ask, fair for whom? What's fair for managers is not necessarily fair for workers, for men, for women. And that's why we need this multi-stakeholder governance. And that's why we also need the joint data access and control. So we remove ourselves from this very unilaterally defined version of the world, which we're subject to now.
Thank you, Christine. I know Hitan wants to come in, and then Jonathan, I want to bring you in on the data and the information you've gathered, given your work. But Hitan, over to you.
I just wanted to come back in on the points that have been raised, and data is obviously really, really powerful and important. And something I've just funded through the Friends Provident Foundation is a new bit of work with the Behavioural Insights team, looking at what would behavioral insights replayed back into economic policy look like? Because although behavioral economics has been really powerful, it's not been put into economic policy that much, and data will be really key to that. But I think the flip point on all of this is that we mustn't kid ourselves that data is sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient, because we've known about data on climate change for years and years and years. There's overwhelmingly clear data on poverty and destitution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to change anything. So there's more that's required in terms of political action alongside data.
So technology isn't a silver bullet, data alone isn't a silver bullet, I think is what you're saying. But Jonathan, obviously it's not the answer to everything, but through your work and Sage's work, you have been looking at perhaps gathering information and insights and data from SMEs right across the whole of the UK in terms of the economic benefits that increased digitization could bring to societies and regions. So what is your work telling you, and how do we make sure that we bring people, on this, I hate to say it, on this journey, or we make sure participation seems to be a key word here of everybody. So how do we get those businesses that are really going to be impacted by this positively or negatively involved as well?
So yeah, so I think an overwhelming feeling from businesses, especially now in the current kind of economic climate, is they need help and they need support from central government, from local government. And I think incentives to be able to make those investments is really important. But I think, like everyone's saying, I think also using that data and improving the data, because to be able to make that that support and those incentives a lot more focused, and being able to bring that support to bear in the areas, whether that's geographic or sectoral or areas that most need it, rather than blanket programs of support, of which are very then difficult to track. And by being more precise, not only in its delivery but also in execution, we can then see what works, what doesn't, and actually iterate. Because I think that's a key approach, that governments don't get everything right first time, and actually there's a lot that could be learned from the approach that many people on the call today in their day jobs within the tech community, that we're constantly experimenting, we're constantly trying to work out what works. And I think that as members of society, we have to not expect government to get it right straight away. And I think I'm taking from this conversation, I completely agree with, we all have to be involved. We've all got a stake in the outcomes here, and I think we've got to be patient. We've got to be patient with each other, and we've just got to kind of keep moving towards that goal.
Thank you, Jonathan. Christina, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think there's an additional thing that we're going to have to look at, and that is our markets, right? What is the market logic? What does the market reward? What does it penalize? And here I think we need to bring the what they're called now. Oh, I forget their name. Anyway, Moody's and the rest of them. What are they called? Sorry, I've just got a total blackout. Moody's. Credit agencies. There you go. Thank you. Oh, we need to bring them to the table, right? I mean, the criteria on which they rate companies and also countries' economies, if those criteria were changed so that, any corporate behavior or country behavior that went against the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, were penalized, that would very quickly give and countries the economic incentive to put some of these policies in place. And I really think, if we go back to the logic of the market, which seems to be rewarding negative behavior in relation to inclusion and so on, then we will not get away with any of the suggestions we've put on the table now.
Priya, over to you.
Yes, this was just a very brief point to follow up on Christina's theme, that if anyone in the audience hasn't listened to them yet, I would highly recommend tuning into Mark Carney's Reith lectures that are happening at the moment. He is, as everyone knows, I'm sure, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, and he is essentially arguing that our definition of economic value is wrong. as a society. And it's a very, very fascinating discussion on exactly this theme. So just wanted to recommend that if anyone hasn't heard it yet.
Thanks, Priya. That's great. Hitan, come in. You're on mute, Hitan. Sorry.
Yes,
it's the phrase of the year. Don't worry. We're on point.
I just wanted to come in on this point about the wider investment system, which I think is really important. So the UK, I think, suffers from, we've got an economy which is largely fueled by consumption and household debt rather than investment led. And so how do you reshape the incentives for longer term investment horizons? And I think there's a few things that, work we've done at the British Academy around purpose-led companies and, a broader notion of shareholder value, of improved representation of stakeholders on boards, all of those sorts of things, I think, is part of the equation. But also work that we've been funding through the Friends Provident Foundation, organizations like Share Action, which get pension managers to really campaign for environmental and social rights through, so these are the sleeping giants of our investments, but we don't tend to know what happens to them, as it were. So how do we really drive up the market for ESG investment, etc.? It's not easy to access through our kind of cash ISAs at the moment. How do we make that kind of just available to everybody?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I wanted to get into a bit more, particularly with people like Priya who are involved in that kind of VC and startup community, of how do we help and to your point as well, how do we move forward in not just in the way that changes perhaps some of the what has existed for many years, because of the opportunity, as we've all talked about, this is an opportunity for change, right? This is an opportunity to reinvention. This is an opportunity way. So how do we do it, or what do we need to do to make sure we do that in an ethical, responsible way? And Priya, I'm thinking about from your perspective in terms of the work you do in that kind of VC community, of how do we is that on people's minds, is that on people's agendas, and if not, how do we get it there?
So I think if you're looking specifically in the space of private sector VC investment, for me, the one way we shift this narrative goes back to what we talked about right at the beginning in the introduction, which is those companies perform better as businesses. And therefore, if you want to maximize the returns for your LPs as a VC fund, it's an absolute no-brainer to be investing in underrepresented groups. The challenge is that so many people still see the concept of investing in specifically a female founder or specifically a Black founder as some sort of CSR activity. This is not CSR. This is not a sort of, side tick box exercise. This is actually you taking the right and most effective decisions for your business as an investor. And if we can just change that one piece of narrative, we will really change the way that the whole sector thinks. And it's starting to happen, but it's happening very, very slowly. And there are so many people who haven't quite got their head around that concept yet.
Yeah. Jonathan, I'm interested whether you see this as, is it on those smaller businesses and the businesses that you work with? Is it on their agendas, or do we need to help them to think about how they can move forward in this way? And therefore, do we need, do they have what they need? Is it about, partnerships? Is it about bringing people together? How do we get this on people's agendas that, let's face it, are in post-COVID are just looking at, keeping the business going, right?
Oh, completely. So I think what's on the mind of many small businesses is, what their business looks like as they're coming out of this. So, with it's great news that we have a vaccine on the way, but nothing's going to get back to normal anytime soon. That's a risk, and that's also an opportunity. Businesses need to be much more digitally enhanced and digitally enabled than perhaps they were previously. Smaller businesses need to look at this a lot more than perhaps they have done in the past. That's again where we come back to the problem of investment. And if you're not making money, then you're not building reserves and you're not then able to invest. And that's just a fundamental, isn't it? So there needs to be support there. Also, we need to look at the opportunity. We mentioned it a while ago about the high streets. So, how can micro businesses and small businesses in particular are actually core parts of their local communities, and we know, and I can't remember the stat, but money spent in small businesses within a community stays within that community and is recycled to communities many more times. And just because we see, we hear horror stories of big tech and big platforms wiping out small businesses, there are many areas, and especially in community, that those businesses can't actually serve as well. So as part of this conversation, what are the sort of businesses we want to see in our local rejuvenated high streets, for example? And how can we help smaller businesses take on these hybrid models where they have a great digital and online presence, but they also have a fantastic physical presence in the community? And I think that then opens up to small businesses really quite new, novel and innovative business models that they perhaps haven't considered before. But again, back to Christina's point, this takes time. And if you're at the coalface day in, day out, just trying to keep money coming in and cash flow moving, it's very, very difficult to take a step back and look at these things.
Yeah. Christina, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, no, it's a question to Jonathan, but before I pose that question to him, I also really urge everybody on this call to shop local, right? Amazon might be great and very convenient, but I think in Tim Wu's words from his amazing op-ed from 2018, we are falling for the tyranny of convenience, right? So let's get off the sofa and get out there and really shop local. But Jonathan, my question to you, and you mentioned this right in the beginning, was a lot of micro and small companies do not have the capital required to invest in digital technologies that in small scale, larger scale could really help them, social media presence, whatever. Can we draw inspiration from the industrial clusters that we knew from previous industrial revolutions, like in Italy, the shoemakers and so on, and almost imagine communities of businesses who jointly own or develop, deploy technology, rather than we're seeing it now as individual investments? And also, could that actually be the bottom-up way to grow the governance of these digital technologies that are based on the having multiple voices around the table?
That's a really good question and a really interesting concept. I think there is real validity in it. I think small businesses in particular have to come together and have to build clusters, build communities, and it has to be led by those businesses themselves. I think there could well be, with support, some economies of scale there that would help small businesses invest in technologies and own those technologies and make them work for them in a much better way. And it has worked in the past in the physical space. So there's no reason why it shouldn't in the digital space. And I think we'll see. Given that we would see increasing numbers of people still moving into self-employment, into micro business, then there needs to be, it almost feels like in a new way, we're going back to that craft-based business. You talk about the Italian shoemakers or other geographically specific sectors. But yeah, I think there is a lot there, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
Which not wanting to come back to all the Italian shoemakers, but it does make me wonder also in terms of when we're looking at these, are there examples of countries or regions around the world that are already doing this or getting this right, or is there best practice and approaches or practices that we perhaps should look at adopting and even perhaps scaling? I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that. Priya, I think you had your hand up, right? Oh, you're on mute, Priya, sorry.
Thank you. It wouldn't be a good virtual event if we didn't have lots of those. So, you know, for those of you who know me well will know that in my previous life I was a diplomat for the UK government for 20 years, and so for me, sort of international is ingrained in my bloodstream. And I think one of the real risks, particularly with some of the narrative we're seeing around, you know, will we, won't we on a Brexit trade deal, is that, you know, we become very isolationist and see this as, you know, a UK problem that only the UK can solve by, you know, having specifically UK things, UK solutions that will work. You know, the reality is this is a global problem. And I think we have a lot to learn from areas like climate action, where actually, rightly, the world is coming together to try and resolve, and hopefully with some new impetus with the new US administration under President-elect Biden, you know, we will see a global movement reinvigorated with COP in Glasgow next year that will, you know, share solutions, share targets, and actually hopefully start to seize this, you know, final opportunity we have to address climate action. But I don't think, you know, this is limited to areas like climate. What we need to be doing is looking at areas in every part of the world where we can learn what is going well and what solutions are. You know, you asked for examples. There are many things that India doesn't do right in terms of policy. Of course there are. But actually one of the things that it's done really well is things like digital identity. You know, the Aadhaar scheme that was brought into India a number of years ago, you know, has really transformed the ability for an individual citizen to have direct access to the services and provisions that are set up to be given to that individual citizen. If you look at a lot of the things that we brought in the UK and, you know, in other countries like Estonia and the other sort of digital nations that are thinking about delivery of government services, there's so much we can learn from how to bring government services online in an inclusive way to, you know, that journey is accessible to everybody, whether you're sort of, you know, an 80-year-old granny or whether you're, you know, a tech savvy 14-year-old. Those are really, really great and important conversations to be having. And I think, you know, one of the real risks that I see is that we become more isolationist and inward looking instead of looking at actually, let's learn from everywhere in the world, because we'll only find solutions if we do this together.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we at Tech UK really, you know, want to focus on next year and make sure that we are looking beyond and looking at what is happening around the world. And actually this new virtual way of working, we've had so many more people from around the world even involved in the summit this year that we perhaps would not have done before. So I think it's already happening. But Christina, did you have your hand up? Did you want to come in on that? No. Anybody, Hitan or Jonathan, anything from a kind of, yeah, Hitan, from an international perspective or anything you would highlight?
I mean, I, you know, absolutely agree with Priya that we should just be looking out for what others do and learning from that, and it's a two-way process. At the same time, the question is, you know, what can we graft onto the kind of where we are, given we are different? And, you know, one of the things is we're heavily centralized, our government and our, you know, if you look at the way local government works here. So one of the things I would really like to see over the long term is a shift to more local economic decision making, stronger funding of local authorities and so on. But that's just, we're so far away from that if you tried to transplant that kind of approach from somewhere that does that already, it's not that easy to do. But I do think the thing that we're sort of moving towards is the notion of industrial strategy, which, you know, 10 years ago was anathema, but now every government wants an industrial strategy. So it seems to me we should really push on that. And where we can learn is, you know, not just having an industrial strategy, which is for the sexy tech bits of the economy, but actually the everyday economy. So what does an industrial strategy for care workers, for retail, you know, for the people who've got these who are trapped in essentially low paid, high turnover jobs? How do we make those sectors much more like Scandinavia, where these are really highly skilled jobs where you have career tracks and so on?
Yeah.
And then the other area, I think, is the green industrial strategy. You know, people have talked about a Green New Deal, and that's a nice label, but what does it look like? And I think we've got, in a sense, the template of the Climate Act, where we set a target every 5 years and then have a kind of process to say how we're going to get there. could we do that across other areas? So could we have a Sustainable Economy Act, which actually looks at that for waste, for land use, for pollution, for all sorts of other things as well?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, Hitton. And one of the issues we're actually very quickly running out of time, but one of the issues we want to talk about is what kind of economic, sustainable, inclusive growth we were talking about. What does that look like? You know, is it green? Is it, you know, is it more focused on local? And Jonathan, I'd love your points on that. But Christina, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. But that relates also to your question there, because you know, we have the sustainable development goals, right? And then we could organize our economies around that. I think it's very dangerous to say we have an industrial policy and then a climate policy and then a social policy, when what we've actually all been saying here on the call is how intertwined all of this is, right? So that could be a really good starting point, is to actually say, well, we cannot no longer separate these things from one another. I also really want to say one thing about sort of this community. We've been sort of leaning towards it, this community data joint control and access. I think it would be very interesting for more people to talk to the indigenous people about how they and others don't have an individualized notion of who am I and my rights and the individualized rights, which are really entwined in the GDPR in many of our laws, but that we learn to think about the community, that we lift our eyes a little bit and say, is everybody near me, both geographically but also spiritually and in kindred spirit? Are they included in this? And this will take, I know this sounds almost hairy-fairy, but it will actually take, in a country like the UK, which is, let's face it, a class-divided society, it will take that we really dare throw the cards up in the air and start rethinking a lot of these things. And my best, thoughts there is that we hurry up slowly, that we have more conversations like this one to find out, wow, 4 people here from very different backgrounds seem to be approaching these themes with different ideas, but almost a consensus around that things must change. And, go to the community centers, go to the libraries, go to create online spaces where we invite the voices. And Hatton, you mentioned this in the beginning, and I really welcome that. We invited the voices that don't come to all these fancy conferences, right? And I really think that we're going to have to start, all of us privileged on this call, by committing to doing that and by bringing in the voices of those seldom heard.
Absolutely. One of the questions that we had in the chat was around the role of the tech sector in addressing the issues being discussed, of course, and I think, Jonathan, you touched on that, but also, can the issues even be addressed without fundamentally changing our social and economic relations to each other? So I think, Christina, what you're saying is that no, we need to throw the cards in the air and think about how we are engaging and how we're the relationship between each other at a social and economic point of view. I think that's what you're. Is that what you're all saying? Is this is a time for change, right? Jonathan, I would be interested in your view in terms of it's the time for change in that point around industrial strategy, but at the local level. So for micro businesses, for SMEs that you're working with, that you see, is it local change at the local level that's needed, or is it national change at the national level? Or, and I think I probably know the answer to this, is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it comes back to, again, what I think the fundamental point is what we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation about what do we value. And I think in terms of how we get there, it's not just local and bottom up or national top down. It has to be both. I mean, that's I think fairly obvious. It's how we get that and how we make that happen. But I think we can't underestimate, I think it was Margaret Mead that said, the power of a small group of committed citizens to make change, and I think that is what we've got to start somewhere. We've got to perhaps start small, and that will be pockets of people working locally. That will be people at a national level, and just moving forward towards a common goal. But I think the real key thing is as we move out of COVID and start rebuilding back better, or whatever the term is what do we value in our economy? And I think Hetson made a really good point about those areas of the economy that we have valued throughout this crisis, the healthcare sector, the care sector, that how do we put those areas of the economy on a much stronger footing and give much more support and more value. And it's come out in the Reith lectures Priya mentioned before, and also other work that's been done around value in the economy. And these are really, really important conversations that we need to have.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you for that, Jonathan, for all of you. It's a really important conversation. This is a vital conversation. This isn't going to end here, right? This is a conversation that we and Tech UK need to continue having in 2021, and we hope you'll all be part of that. But as we wrap up and bring this, I go so quickly, guys, I hate it, but as it comes to a close, I perhaps want to give the last word to all of our panelists as we look into 2021. And I don't know about you, but it's hard to believe that we are actually now coming to the end of this year. I mean, what a year. What is the one, and I will give you two at a push, Luciano kind of got away with two, but what is the one area where you'd really like to see action in 2021 so that we can perhaps seize this opportunity, but also get it right for everybody? Priya, why don't I come to you to kick off, if I may?
So for me, the one thing I would like to see happen in 2021 is aspirational targets for government funding interventions to make sure that we are nudging society to be more inclusive for underrepresented groups. I'm thinking about particularly tech founders, but I think the argument goes more broadly.
Thank you. Jonathan.
So I think the one thing for me would be those incentives and that support to enable and get inclusive, to allow the smallest of businesses to be able to invest in technology that will enable them to start to recover as we move into next year.
Wonderful. Thank you. So succinct as well. Brilliant. Christina, your thoughts?
I can only have one. Well,
it's Christmas. I'll allow two.
Oh,
how about that?
So we need to talk again. I think that's number one. And yes, I totally agree. We need to change the incentives of the market.
Brilliant, Christina. And Hitan, the last word to you again. I will allow you to. How about that?
Thanks, Sue. Well, I'm just to repeat the context, and I think, one thing, we've never mentioned Brexit in this conversation, but it's worth saying, in a sense, all of the things we've been talking about, Brexit is like a slow puncture on the economy, and it's going to make us fight against the tide even harder. In terms of things to do, I will give myself two, if that's all right. I mean, there's a short run one. What's the opportunity in this year which the government could get behind? And they've got this levelling up agenda, so let's make the most of that, but let's make it a real thing. So, a 4 billion bung through a kind of levelling up fund is not going to make a big difference, I don't think, after years of underfunding of local government, etc. So what we're talking about in terms of reimagining the high street so that it becomes properly sort of a community place, I think is a real opportunity, and something that this government, I think, could really get behind. The longer run one, and again, the government is supportive of this, is investment in research and development, because that is the long-term source of prosperity. And we still, we're spending something like 1.7% of GDP. OECD average, I think, is 2.4%. We're still a long way from that. The government has committed to do it, but, we've got to keep their feet to the fire on that.
Well, thank you, Hitan, and great points to end on as well, and a lot of food for thought there, and a lot of key issues that you're absolutely right, Christina, that we need to keep talking, and we're really keen to do that as well, and to help play our role in how do we get this right going forward. But I hope you will all agree that that's really given us a really good race through of some of the really big key issues, but also let's be optimistic. We're looking into 2021. Next year will be different. We know next year will be different, and looking at how we rebuild, recover, reinvent our economy and how we do it in a way that realizes the opportunity, but also that brings everybody along with us. Thank you, Christina, to Jonathan, to Priya and Hitan for being part of such a fascinating panel. Rapturous virtual applause to all of you. Thank you so much. And that brings to a close this breakout session at the Digital Ethics Summit.